Well, I'm sure most of you know our mission statement as well as we do these days, but we exist, the Knoxville History Project, to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. You can find on our Engage page on our website, you can, right down at the bottom right is History Happy Hours. And that's where we have recorded many of these Zoom sessions that we do monthly now, since we started doing this on a weekly basis. Some of you may remember back in 2020, all the way back those years ago at the start of the pandemic. And with, I don't know how many we've got recorded. Nicole could probably tell us, but probably almost 100, I think, that we've done, close to that. Thanks to Nicole for getting these recorded, and then we upload them next week. We are a nonprofit. We exist and thrive on your donations. So if you've donated recently, thank you. If you'd like to consider a donation to support the work of this nonprofit, we sincerely appreciate it. Always put a shout out for our partner, partner Laura Still with Knoxville Walking Tours. It's cooled down a little bit. So if you have would like to join Laura on a walking tour, meet her outside the History Center, which is appropriate for Warren being here tonight. But she's also going to be with us, and Warren and the great staff and volunteers and crew at the East Tennessee History Museum on Saturday for the East Tennessee History Hootenanny, which Warren is going to be telling us all about in a bit greater detail a little bit later. But we are thrilled that Arcadia Publishing have partnered with ETHS, and there's going to be a whole host of Arcadia, Images of America authors and some other authors, including myself and Jack. I did the book on Iams about 10, 12 years ago. And as many of you know, our latest book that came out early January is on the pictorial history of downtown Knoxville. Jack is doing a walking tour at 11. Laura's doing a walking tour at 1:30. Put a lot of the information in the chat bar already. And Jack and I, part of the local authors panel, I think it starts at 10, and then with Warren at, I think, 11:30, something like that. Check the chat bar. Also, lastly, I want to thank our supporters. The Department of the Interior Treasury and gave us a grant through the Arts and Culture Alliance in the city of Knoxville to help underwrite this series that we're doing for the next, through next June. So thanks to that great support. I'm going to hand it over to Jack to do an introduction to Warren. So thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks to Nicole for making this work as she's helped with the last couple of years of this now. But I'm pleased and honored to get to introduce Dr. Warren Dockter. He's perhaps the most, I was telling him that has the most unusual resume of a nonprofit chief in Knoxville that I know of, and arguably the most impressive one. He has a PhD from the University of Nottingham. He is a former research fellow at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge, and was a lecturer at and I hope I can pronounce this, Aberystwyth University in international politics in Wales. He is taught at the University of Exeter, the University of Worcester, the University of London. He's a member of the Council of the British Institute at Ankara, Turkey. He's known as a scholar of international and imperial history. And he's especially known for his work on Churchill. He wrote a book called Churchill and the Islamic World, which kind of challenged some assumptions about Winston Churchill, and also worked with Boris Johnson. And yes, that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, on a book called The Churchill Factor. I think Boris Johnson returned the favor when he wrote the intro to Warren's another Churchill book called Winston Churchill at the Telegraph, having to do with both things that Winston Churchill wrote and things that other people wrote about Winston Churchill at that famous publication. Anyway, but why is he here? Well, he was born in Granger County, and he spent some time in Blount County growing up, and we're grateful to have him back just when we needed a new chief of the biggest historical organization in East Tennessee, the East Tennessee Historical Society, this 35 county organization, and after the retirement of our friend Cheryl Henderson, who has since passed away. Warren Dockter has taken over this organization and is doing interesting things with it, and we'll hear a lot more about that now, but especially the upcoming Hootenanny. But without further ado, Dr. Warren Dockter, welcome.
Thank you very much for that, Jack. It's a tremendous honor to be here and to talk to everyone. And you don't have to worry about my CV. You can just call me Warren. I don't need to. I'm a pretty humble guy. And I'll go ahead and dive into my talk. So this is just the title thing, and you can find me on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram. It's just my name. Yeah, go ahead, Paul. So the first thing to say about me is as Jack indicated, I lived in the UK for 12 years and have helped the Prime Minister write a book on Churchill. I am a Churchill scholar. I'm very interested in imperial history and British history. But of course, there's an interesting overlap, which I'll come to later, about empires and the British being in East Tennessee. So it's kind of a natural fit for my scholarship. But before I was any of those things, I was an East Tennessean. I grew up in Granger County and Blount County. And so I was in and out of Knoxville all the time growing up. This is a picture on the left of a road called Poor Valley in Granger County that I used to drive up and down when I got my driver's license. And the picture above my head there, that's my grandfather's house in Blount County. And I spent a lot of time there, particularly when I was going in college. I lived with him. That was the old Babcock house when they built a wood mill very near that in the Vose community over in Alcoa. And so I spent a lot of time in Blount County and in Rutledge and in Granger County. And it was my grandfather who got me really interested in history. And I should also mention, I'm at my dad's house. I could put him on camera, but I'm not going to do that. And he also got me interested in history. And we used to sit around the table, and I got to listen to them duke it out about the Civil War or the American Revolution. And of course, I grew up in this household, so I got very interested in history. And Pap, when I was very young, started taking me to different places. And it started in Knoxville. We would travel to the different historic homes, the Ramsey House or, Marble Springs. James White Ford's one of the very first places we went. And then we started kind of expanding outward as I grew up. And we took trips to all the Civil War sites and to all the American Revolutionary sites. And then eventually out west to see different things. I'm very fortunate in that I have been to every state but Hawaii. And a large part of that is to do with my grandfather who helped install this love of history in me. And so when I went to UT, there's no question, I was very interested in history. That was my major. And then I worked with my dad's sign company, and I was then able to get a scholarship and get a small scholarship and go to Nottingham to do my MA. And then I went back and got a kind of a full ride for my PhD there. And while I was in Britain, I should say, actually, my grandfather took me to Britain when I was just in high school, and I got very interested in genealogy there. So it all kind of links back to East Tennessee, because as we know, East Tennessee is a sort of Scotch-Irish place. And as I've come to know, it's also a very Welsh place, having lived in Aberystwyth and been a professor of international politics there for years. Wales is also intrinsically linked into East Tennessee and indeed in most of Appalachia, particularly coal-producing parts of Appalachia. And so I went there and decided, and I enjoyed my time there very much. But when this opportunity come back and kind of be with my first love in history, East Tennessee, I absolutely jumped at the chance. So then I was very happy to come home and be with my friends and family. So that's kind of my story. And I would just be brief there. The second thing I want to do is talk about what we're doing at the East Tennessee Historical Society. So if you'll hit the next thing, Paul. This is sort of what we are. If you don't know about the East Tennessee Historical Society or the History Center, I just wanted to show it to you. As Jack indicated, we are sort of responsible for 35 counties, and we run the Museum of East Tennessee History. And these are a couple shots. That's the streetscape down there on the right. And then it's a very poor photo, and I'm sorry about that, but that's the actual Davy Crockett rifle that we possess in the gallery. And so, it's a tremendous responsibility, but it's a lot of fun. And we do a lot of fun things I think that you can see that a lot of the way people experience museums is kind of changing. And so that's some of the stuff that we've been focused on lately. We've gotten a federal grant, our first federal grant in a while, and we're using that to do master planning or pre-planning for master planning on what needs to change in the gallery. And so ways to update the gallery, ways to be more inclusive, which stories we should tell, because we have a finite amount of space. And so these are some of the things we've done. We're also working on updating our website. I don't know if you've been to our website, but it's a bit sort of web 1.0. And I'm hoping to make it more sleek, much like the History Project website. And so that's one of the things that we're doing. And we've also been conducting listening sessions into various communities to see what it is people want to see in their museums. Because I didn't want to run in and just sort of change everything willy-nilly. I thought it was important to listen to different communities to see what it is they want. And so this federal grant has been paying us to do this sort of deep work so that we can begin the master planning process and do it with all these different voices in mind. So that's a component of what we do, is keeping the museum going, but we also have to keep the museum fun. So if you could put me through again, Paul, to the next. There we go. So some of the things that we've done since I've been there, and I want to start in the upper left-hand corner. That's a picture of our really fun interactive gallery. It's called History Headquarters, and it's sort of for kids. And I'm really standing on Cheryl's shoulders in this. This was really her idea, and it was designed by Adam Alfrey, who's brilliant and works with us. But this is a fun interactive space to have where people can do almost like history breakout rooms. There's lots of things you can probably, I don't know if you can make it out in the corner, but they teach basket weaving and some of the old skills from the 19th century. This is obviously where people could gather around and see a puppet show, but there's also really interesting things that are not in here. One of them is a sort of history breakout room where you have to solve puzzles and kind of solve mysteries to find out who certain East Tennessean figures are. And then also, there is a really cool thing where you can do stop motion animation and then email it to yourself. So we have lots of like aspiring directors who are kids that play with this sort of technology, which is really fun to watch that happen. But we also put on a lot of interesting exhibits. So the exhibit that we have on currently right now, which will be ending in October, is You Should Have Been There, which was about the 1982 World's Fair. Jack, of course, has been giving tours about the 1982 World's Fair. We've had a lot of great feedback. And if you've not seen the exhibit on the 1982 World's Fair, the Energy Expo, I really recommend everyone see it. We've had loads of really good feedback, and it's a lot of fun. Although, let me tell you this, working in the building, you get those songs stuck in your head. And if I hear another song about the Sun Sphere, I don't know what I'm going to do. Especially at night when you're closing up and it's just that song. So that's my own thing. But the upcoming program that we have coming on Saturday is a History Hootenanny. And it's going to be a lot of fun. And what we want to do with the History Hootenanny, just so everybody knows, is this is a way to showcase all the things we do in the building. Now, this is on the same day. It used to be the History Fair, right, on the 20th of August. And I wanted to move away from doing a history fair for a couple reasons. And the first was it had become so unwieldy and it was so hot. It was very difficult to manage and make sure everyone was safe and was having a good time. The other issue was there's a lot of public space that we don't have access to in the same way. So we had to figure out a way to take History Fair and put it in the building, which is what creates a History Hootenanny. Now, Jack and I were talking earlier about the word hootenanny. And hold on, let me tell you what all we're doing first, and then I'll come back to the hootenanny point. But there's going to be authors signing books. Obviously, Jack and Paul are going to be there, which we're very excited about. We're going to be having Arcadia Books will be having a panel where we talk with different authors about how to write history books and what they can do, what the experience of publishing is like. Upstairs, we'll be running a genealogy conference that sort of starts at 9:30 in the morning and goes throughout the day. There are 4 different sessions. And if you want more information, I could tell everyone to go on to easttnhistory.org. That's much more, it'll give you a much clearer picture than the picture I'm giving you now. But there's lots of things in terms of history that we're offering here and for different audiences. So there's a lot of activities for kids in the History Headquarters. And we have some of the historic homes, including Marble Springs, are coming into the gallery with kids' activities from sort of the 19th century, historical kid games that kids can play. But we also have walking tours that, of course, Paul and Laura Steele will be giving. And we have bus tours that will go to different historic homes, including Ramsey House and Maybury Hazen, as well as Blunt Mansion. So there really is a whole lot of what to do. And I appreciate Paul put that in the bar. So a hootenanny. This question's come up a lot, and I just answered this question on WBAR, and Jack and I were talking about it. A hootenanny, if you look up the etymology of the word, it's really fascinating. So I'm going to take us backwards in time. Hootenanny today is, and Jack can jump in and correct me, because there's an interesting side story that I'm probably going to have time to get to, but I think Jack can handle it. So a hootenanny is a sort of informal gathering where music is played, typically Americana music. This definition was popularized sort of shortly after the Second World War, and some of the leading proponents were Woody Guthrie, who popularized it, as well as Seeger. Who is it, Jack?
Pete Seeger.
Pete Seeger, that's right. And so this became a huge and interesting thing. But what I did, and we all sort of know that that's what a hootenanny involves, music. But what I didn't know was that it's also, so if you flash back to the 1930s, so it's a very 20th century based word, it was an Appalachian saying for like a whatchamacallit. Like if you couldn't think of something it was called, you'd be like, oh, it's a hootenanny, like a who's it's or a what's it's. But if you go even further back in time, all the way back to the 15th century, it's a Scottish Gaelic word, or a variation of a Scottish Gaelic word, which is a hogomammy. Now, hogomammy, which they still have in Scotland to this day, is a party. It's a celebration, often with music, often with libations, in which you celebrate the new year, the coming of the new year. So the journey of the word hootenanny, I think, is a very interesting one, because it's very Scottish and then sort of, transmutates into a very American thing by the 20th century. And I think that that's really remarkable and shows how dynamic the language is. So that's what we're doing on Saturday, is having a hootenanny, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Paul, can you put us on the next slide here? So some of the other things that we do in the museum, and we were talking about the temporary exhibits. I showed you the 1982 World's Fair. We also had one called History in Black and White, which was about Jim Crow and African-American experience in Knoxville during the Jim Crow era. And we also have, of course, the famous Hillbilly History of Mountain Dew, which was another. These are all award-winning exhibitions that we've put on. And in fact, East Tennessee Historical Society won 6 TAM awards this year, including the President's Award, which is a very prestigious award in the museum world. We also put on regular lectures that we call the Brown Bag Lectures. You can see that's our summer and fall for 2022. And so we keep things kind of constantly moving. And one of the things that we've done with the lectures I'm really proud of is we do it sort of hybrid Zoom. So, because of COVID, and that's something that we've all struggled with. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should mention I'm on Jack and Paul's board. But one of the things that the History Project has done well is have Zoom sessions like we're having now. But when we started bringing people back, I still wanted to be able to reach out, because not everybody in all 35 counties can be in Knoxville at noon on a Wednesday, right? So we wanted to have the Zoom, and it's been very, very good. We usually get an additional anywhere between 50 and 90 people across East Tennessee watching our lectures now. And so that's something that we've maintained. And so the lectures are a lot of fun. Okay, Paul, what's the next slide? This is one of the important slides as well. And for our members, and of course, I would like to take the opportunity to invite anyone who's not a member to join the society. In addition to getting free membership or free entry to the museum, we also provide these publications. Newsline comes out twice a year, and so does Tennessee Ancestors, which is our genealogical journal. It's been in circulation since 1978 and is very, very fascinating. And then, of course, and this is a poor picture, I apologize, the Journal of East Tennessee History, which has actually been in publication since 1929. And this is one of our flagship publications. And one of the projects that I've undertaken since I've come into the position is to digitize all the back issues. So those of you who are scholars will know it can be frustrating if you have to go into a library to physically look something up, even though that is also something we kind of enjoy, us scholarly book people. But to get things out to students, to make sure that our work is being cited in journals, I thought it was very important to digitize everything and make it available online. So we're partnering with Project Muse. I don't know if you know that, it's like JSTOR for the Journal of East Tennessee History. And then we will be providing on our new website a digital version of Tennessee Ancestors, which we've just about totally digitized. And we're about 80% of the way through the Journal of East Tennessee History. We have a very nice scanner that has been doing fabulous work. But it is a slow process, and I'm hoping to get all this done and ready to go for 2023. Okay, Paul, the next. So I included this just because to underscore the fact that we also have a lot of fun in the museum. It's a lot of hard work, but this picture here is a picture of me with Shannon Holloway from Channel 10, and she came in to do, they did a story on Museum Selfie Day for us. And she wanted to do a picture. This is a picture of me taking a selfie of her, me and her, with her jumping in the air. Like you can't really see the picture of him jumping, but it's a fantastic shot. And we actually entered it into a competition for best selfie at the Tennessee Association Museum Conference, but sadly we did not win, which I still think is an outrage, quite frankly. But you know, I wanted to kind of give a scope of the size of the museum. I hope that most of the people here that are listening today have probably been in as you're fans of the Knoxville History Project. And, you know, that's one of the things is our gallery, it's sort of deceptive. It's actually really massive. And there's an item from every one of the 35 counties to tell the story of East Tennessee, which I think is very important. It's also important because it kind of underscores the differences that exist between us and the Knoxville History Project, because obviously the Knoxville History Project is solely focused on Knoxville, whereas we're focused on the entire region. In fact, Knoxville very rarely shows up in the museum exhibition in Voices of the Land, which is what it is called. And I think that shows a great synchronicity in the way that we approach history. Okay, Paul, what's the next one we got? I think, yeah, so I'm now gonna, that's all the sort of fun stuff about me and about the center. And I'm now gonna, because I was a history professor, I'm now gonna give you a little history. So as you've seen about me talking about the Hootenanny, I'm really interested in the etymology of words. And I got really interested in the etymology of Tennessee because it's a very fascinating story. And so we're now gonna move into the final part of my talk. So if you wanna go ahead, Paul. This story begins in many ways at the Spanish, with Spanish conquistadors. The first time the Spanish move into the areas in the sort of 1540s, and that's Hernando de Soto and his initial sort of run when he joined. There we go. I was covering up my notes. Hernando de Soto in the 1540s, and this was a sort of very famous kind of Spanish expedition inward. There was another conquistador he was with Tristan de Luna, who served with De Soto and was sort of less successful. But this story begins, the word Tennessee begins when Captain Juan Pardo entered what was sort of crossing the border where many scholars now think was probably around Newport. And he encountered a tribe there. And the tribesmen, once they had established communication, which we now know to be a group called the Yuchi. Now, this is still debated by ethnologists and people who study Native Americans, because some people argue that the Yuchi were a sort of subset of the Creek tribes. So I'm not going to try to settle that debate today, but what I am going to tell you is when they got there in the Spanish notes, and you can still find this in Juan Pardo's papers, and if you see this stone structure in the presentation here, that is actually his tomb. In his memoirs and things, it is recorded as the Yuchi people describing the area, and the way it was pronounced is Tenasque. And this was a Yuchi word. And so this is where our story begins, is with the Spanish encountering the Yuchi people before the Cherokee were even here, and hearing that this area was called Tenasque. Okay, Paul, if you want to. Now, if you flash forward a little bit and we move from the 16th century into the 17th century, unsurprisingly, other traders and explorers start moving into the region. Once the Spanish Empire kind of is in recession after 1588. And so in 1673, and this is something I think is quite remarkable, from the first sort of British explorer came from the colony of Virginia, and his name was Abraham Wood, and he brought with him James Needham, and they sort of moved into Cherokee territory now and started encroaching from the east. But simultaneously in the west, French explorers in the same year, that's what I find remarkable, Jacques Marquette, who is on the left there, and Louis Gillet, who's on the right, who is a fur trader, started moving into West Tennessee and exploring the Mississippi Valley and setting up sort of Western positions. And so what's really interesting is as they start to move, particularly the British now, because I'm using British sources and not French sources, and also we're talking about East Tennessee, they start encountering and dealing with the Cherokee more very early on. And so some of the traders eventually encounter the Cherokee at a place that we now know is in Monroe County. And this is the actual monument where this was. And they asked, what was this place called? And the word was Tenase, and it's pronounced Tenase in Cherokee. But what I find remarkable is it starts appearing on British maps with the name Tenase as early as 1725. So you can see this continuity from the Yuchi to the Cherokee to the British. So if you want to move through, and just so you know, the clip in the last one where you could see Tennessee, I sort of stole that from a much later edition than 1725. So this here in the center, that's actually stolen from the draft of the Cherokee County, which we're just about to talk about. So in the 1750s, if you take us forward, Paul, sorry, you have a situation where the British are trying to kind of encroach from South Carolina further into the Appalachian region. There's some debate over whether or not North Carolina would get certain parts of Tennessee and Virginia. But what's important is James Glenn, he starts writing and discussing Tennessee and the Tennessee frontier. And he's the first person who spells Tennessee the way we spell it today. And so in order to garner his favor, Henry Timberlake, who comes and explores Tennessee further, he spent a lot of time with the Cherokee. He was a sort of cartographer and explorer, as well as an officer in the British military, or British colonial military, I should say, has several journeys with the Cherokee. He adopts the governor's spelling of Tennessee. So when he goes in and does a full map of the sort of known area of Tennessee, he calls it Cherokee country. And you can see this is a sort of sampling of it, but that's I sort of borrowed that to make the point earlier. But he writes in his memoirs and sort of pulls this out, what's called the Draft of Cherokee Country. And it's a sort of groundbreaking thing because it's also the literal map that people were using to kind of venture up and use waterways to get into Tennessee. And this spelling was adopted at the Constitutional Convention in 1796 because this is what Henry Timberlake, because that's what James Glenn used. And so you can see this continuity of how it was spelled, but that still doesn't get us closer to the meaning. You could put us over, Paul. Thank you. So what's really interesting is at the turn of the century, there was a lot of research done by an ethnographer named James Mooney. This is a picture of him on the right. And he argued after considerable research that essentially the meaning was lost because it was a Yuchi word that had kind of been adopted and used by the Cherokee in the same way that the Greeks adopted, or excuse me, in the same way that the Romans adopted Greek gods or Greek language around columns, or, for instance, the difference between Ares and Mars, that kind of thing. And so he's saying, look, there's no way to get back to the original meaning. However, there has been a lot of research done recently with what remains of the Yuchi tribe. And there are not many Yuchis left. And there's certainly not many Yuchis left that can speak the Yuchi language. In fact, the last I read, I think it's down to like 15 people. So they're really trying to do in Oklahoma, because I think that they're kept, they're on either the Cree, there's a sort of Cree area of a reservation out there, which they live, and they argue that they are distinct from the Creek. So anyway, again, I'm not getting into that argument. I had this conversation with Quentin Bass about a year ago, and it turned into a whole thing. So there's been a lot of research into this language because they've been trying to save it, or at least save it in ways. And so the most recent research that was done, and I believe this was 2020 or 2021, is that Tenasque could have come from, and I'm going to butcher this, I apologize, from Tenat Tasi, which means brother's waters place. There are other arguments that Tenasque means where the water meets or fork in the river. And if you think about the rivers and the way they act around Newport, you can see that this all sort of works, right? This all kind of fits. But there is a fourth meaning that they had arrived at, which I think is really interesting and is my favorite, the one I choose to believe, which is on the next page. This is some of the Yuchi people, by the way, in the middle. And that is that it means meeting place. I think that's probably, the most poignant thing that it can mean. And the reason I say that is, as you've seen just in the name of Tennessee, the story can't be told through one lens. It's a combination of different people laid on top of each other, layers of empires, layers of colonialism. So if you start with the Yuchi, who were then displaced by the Cherokee, the Spanish met the Yuchi, but by the time the British were here, the Cherokee controlled the area. Most of the Yuchi were forced out and actually, strangely, went to Florida and joined with the Seminole Nation in the Seminole Wars. But then you have the British and the French competing for imperial dominance across Tennessee. And Jack and I talked a little bit about this around the Louisiana Purchase. And then, of course, you have a continued story of people being forced on land and control of the land, even when it becomes America, because of course, then the Cherokee are forced off the land. And it doesn't stop there. It also, when the TVA forced people off their land. So there's a reoccurring, interesting story of kind of imperial projects, right, that take place in East Tennessee. And it makes East Tennessee so historically unique and significant to have all these different civilizations and cultures and empires laid on top of one another, that this is a place where people meet, and it's a place where the past meets the future. And so I think meeting place is probably the most apt. And that's why I choose to believe that is the meaning. That concludes my presentation. I'm now willing to take questions. I tried to be quite quick. I know it's late for everybody, but I've got a little time. If Jack, you've got some questions.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Warren, that's fascinating, and you kind of answered some of the questions I had. But I wonder how you'd respond to the statement that I sometimes make to people on tours and talks and things, that there's no such thing as local history, because I think almost all places, especially Knoxville, are a window into a much larger history, and that's why. And that pertains to the fact that an international scholar in Great Britain might be satisfied coming to East Tennessee and writing and thinking about this place, because everything you talk about, if you walk out of the History Center, you look across the street and there's the old Hotel Farragut. Well, Farragut is a Spanish name. Farragut's father, Admiral Farragut's father, was born on Minorca in Spain, and he fought naval battles in the Black Sea before he came to Knox County. It has an amazing history. And the other direction, Holston Building, you see the sculpture on that was done by an Italian immigrant stone carver, Albert Milani, in 1912. And then you go to the Tennessee Theater, and you got that crazy combination of Asian and Spanish and English influences inside that place. But look at Knoxville history, and you see the troubles in Ireland and the famine in Ireland, and how the German revolutions changed Knoxville and America, and of course the whole African American experience is part of imperial and international history as well. But that I've kind of laid out my theory about that. But if you have anything to
well, so all I can do is add to that, Jack, because I completely agree with you. And this is one of the great kaleidoscopic things of East Tennessee history, is it is so revealing. And these are just a couple stories that I've experienced and can show you this. I was doing research in the National Archive in Britain. Again, this is around Churchill and the Islamic world, one of my books. And I was reading about the sort of British projects around how they were creating certain dams in Egypt to help deal with the Nile. And this is in 1952. And where else would they go to learn about dams? So there's a huge correspondence between Great Britain and the TVA about different ways to block water and way to utilize that to create power. And I was like, wait a minute, I know these guys, I know these names from back home, and so that was a great moment. And another moment when I was working at Aberystwyth, a good buddy of mine named Jeremy Watson came to see me, and he happened to see a grave that was a Watson grave. It wasn't in Aberystwyth. It was near there in a place called McCluntleth, and it's pronounced very oddly. But and he got really interested in this. He had a link. He had a link to a Watson family. A Watson's a Welsh name, and a lot of the Watsons settled on the kind of English-Welsh border, but not all of them did. And he had a link to these people. And so we often talk about the Scotch-Irish link, and it's often like the Welsh are kind of the forgotten little Celtic brother, but they're there too. And so these are just two instances, like in the last, 2 years of my life, where you can see major influences from East Tennessee across the world. I mean, it was major for Jeremy, not for the world, but you know what I mean. Yeah. And so there's just so many things you can see. I mean, one of the things that really fascinates me right now in my own research is if you look at the British fort system that was built in South Carolina, North Carolina, in the Appalachians, in East Tennessee, and you look at the fort system that was used in South Africa, what they call blockhouses, it's the same strategy. It's just being played out 100 years later. And so again, for me, it's so amazing to be like, wow, they've not changed their playbook in like 100 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so these kind of things really fascinate me. And that's one of the things that as an international historian, I absolutely adore about East Tennessee history, is that it's so international. When we were doing research for the 1982 World's Fair, I discovered in Britain when I was back there that they clearly had intelligence operatives in Oak Ridge. And then, of course, the story of Oak Ridge is the story of how East Tennessee literally changed the entire world, right? I mean, if we talk about what would become the Manhattan Project, that begins its life here, and it takes place here. So, East Tennessee is global history. I mean, and it just is. And that's something that I hope I can bring to the East Tennessee Historical Societies to kind of show how important East Tennessee history is.
Yeah. Another thing that happened in the Holston building, by the way, is that the FBI interrogated a Nazi spy they had found living at the YMCA in 1944, which brings me around to my question. I want to give you a chance to write about the guy who was Prime Minister of Great Britain at that time, who's a special favorite of yours, Winston Churchill. Are you going to keep working on your Churchill interest here, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, probably. So you can't ever really get out of that world. So in my spare time, I still just published 2 essays that are going to come out in a Cambridge book about Churchill, the sort of Cambridge Churchill handbook about Churchill and military intelligence. So, but it's not what you think. It's about him as a young soldier when he himself was involved in the intelligence world. So I sort of will always do that, and I'll always look for those kind of links. There are some interesting claims that Churchill stayed in Chattanooga for a couple of evenings, not when he came through to Missouri, right, but when he was on a lecture tour in the early 1900s when he met Mark Twain.
How about that? How about that? I always wished that he had given that Iron Curtain speech in Missouri. It was at a university there, right? And why didn't he do that at UT? Would that have been just as good? But
it would have been much better at UT.
Slightly closer to England. I looked into this. I think the only connection I know of Churchill and East Tennessee, besides that Chattanooga possibility, is that his mother was the 4th cousin of General Grant. So who was in charge of the Chattanooga campaign, and of course Grant was here for a week or 2. But that's kind of a stretching connection.
Tenuous link.
Yeah. But anyway, that's I hope you look farther into international history and find more. I know you have to leave in about 5 minutes, I bet there are questions out there from the audience.
There is a question, Jack, in the chat bar from Christopher Augustus.
Huh?
You see that, Warren?
Hold on, let me.
What is the story behind the relatively straight border between Tennessee and North Carolina, from Unicoi Gap down to Georgia border? You see that in the chat?
Yeah, I do see that. I'm afraid I don't know. I would have to look. I'd need some time to go away and kind of digest that.
Yeah.
I know the sort of boundary lines that were drawn on the Kentucky side, because that's obviously Daniel Boone territory, and and then of course there's a little wedge where of course they had to go back, and then that the way they changed how they were drawing the boundary, and you can kind of still see that in the border. But as far as the border you're talking about, I really am not sure. And it may be to do with there's a mill up there in that corner, and it may have to do with property lines or something. There's some sort of story behind that, and if I would need some time to research it. I just don't know is the short answer.
All right. Well, there's so much fascinating history here. You're headed to Maryville tonight, and Maryville's got its own fascinating history. I'm just recently heard that some of the first Syrian immigrants in America were people who settled, the Arbeelys, who settled in Maryville in the 1870s or 80s, and and that's from New York sources who talk about them. So that there's lots of this under the radar of what we have traditionally talked about, and as the history of East Tennessee over the years. There's a whole lot more diversity than we've acknowledged, and a lot more interest and connections to international themes and politics. But anyway, thanks for everybody for joining us.